obviously sustainability, a lot of people think about like environmental issues and things
Right.
like that, which I obviously like care about, but I think that's also, I mean, we're two, like left-leaning artists. Of course we care about the environment, like,
Yeah.
like, and of course we're trying to do our part and that kind of thing. So I think it's like a lot of people are very heavily involved in that. And when I talk about, like sustainability, I talk about like interpersonal relationships and collaborations and like more towards like a sustainable quote unquote career. That's a main thing. Like I'm really interested in some sort of like continuous fluid cycle rather than a start and a stop point.
This is Music Maker with Tyler Kline, a podcast from Loose Leaf Transmissions. Hello, greetings, Tyler here, and I'm really glad to be joining you for this episode of the podcast, and with me today is composer Andrew Noseworthy. Now, I've known Andrew for about 10 years now after we met at a music festival one summer, and actually, something the two of us have both talked about is how even though we've only interacted with one another in real life just that one time, that 4-week stretch of a festival, it really hasn't felt like that, which is both surprising and I guess also unsurprising. I've been really grateful to be able to maintain a pretty tight as well as supportive friendship with Andrew over space and time, and we touch on why that is a little bit in this conversation, not really specifically, but more in broadly speaking, along with a ton of other great topics. Andrew Noseworthy is a multidisciplinary artist whose music reflects upon the acceptance and rejection of locality, while drawing from lived experiences of isolation within his hometown of Labrador West and the tight-knit arts community of St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, Canada, along with the expansive post-genre scenes of New York City. His work addresses ideas of post-regional spaces and questions of accessibility for the musical voices within them. In this conversation, I ask Andrew about all of those points in his bio, and he discusses them so beautifully and eloquently, but we also talk about his DIY spirit and alternative models of creation that are independent of institutional support, what sustainability and accessibility in a creative practice like composition might look like, and how music outside of the Western classical or contemporary classical repertoire impacts his work. I left this discussion feeling very inspired, and I expect you'll feel the same way, so I hope you enjoy it. Just some business to share here before we jump into this conversation. One of the simplest and really the best way for you to support this podcast is by doing what you're doing now, listening to this episode, listening to earlier episodes, and then also giving us a follow on the podcast app that you're listening from. That'll ensure that you get the newest episode as soon as it's released, pushed straight to your device on Saturday mornings, and will also help our metrics, which we need right now. You can also support what we're doing here and get early access to episodes by becoming a Patreon subscriber for just $5 a month. And yes, that little bit of support does go a long way in helping me cover the cost of some of the tools that I use to produce this podcast. And if an ongoing donation just isn't your thing, I've also got a one-time coffee link along with that Patreon link on our website. That's at looseleaftransmissions.com/support. You can also visit looseleaftransmissions.com/musicmaker to access a transcript of today's discussion, plus helpful links and other information related to this episode and all the other ones. And finally, an impactful and free way to help the Music Maker podcast is, again, to follow us on your favorite streaming app, but also by leaving a rating and a review if you feel inclined. It takes just a few minutes, and the more of those that we have, the more visibility the podcast has, and the more listeners that we have, at least we hope. That's all I've got. Now, on to my conversation with Andrew Noseworthy. Andrew, I just want to say thanks so much for your time today, and I'm really excited to see where this conversation takes us. We're already talking about some good stuff, so I'm sure it's going to be really good.
Yeah, I have no doubt. Yeah.
So where I'd like to start with this is as far back as we can, and of course as far back as you're up for sharing.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I'm wondering what would you describe as your earliest artistic memory as a composer?
Right, right. Definitely like writing songs for bands, I think. Like that's definitely the earliest creative kind of aspect of like writing something or creating something new. And sometimes there's been times where I've thought about that as disconnected from like life as a quote unquote composer or a capital C composer. And there's been times where I've thought about it as kind of connected along the same path. I think these days I think about it more as connected along the same path because there's certain like ideas or gestures or sounds or textures that even as I evolve and even as I like grow as a person and I grow with experience and knowledge that I still like gravitate towards, like especially as I'm getting older and like now in my 30s, I'm finding that even as I discover new things, there's still certain kinds of things that I gravitate towards and that are like identifiable things. So yeah, I think my earliest memory would be when would have been the earliest band that I wrote original material with? Maybe like when I was 13 or 14,
Yeah.
playing in some different prog metal bands or like playing in like some different very DIY, very like in the basement hardcore bands and just like writing for those kinds of things. And I was interested in, progressive kinds of things at that time, which kind of bordered on composing and then became
Yeah.
like transitional to being a quote unquote composer.
So you're a guitarist. So when you say bands, you're talking, well, you describe like progressive and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And that's very different from my experience growing up as a musician because I was in like the school band
Right.
and a lot
Right.
of the
Yeah.
people I know, here in the United States, that was their formative musical identity. Of course, we also play guitar and and all this. I was a bass player growing up and played in bands as well. But did you have any experience in school, like school music programs, or were you strictly, playing in bands as a guitarist, kind of in your free time? That was the thing you did for fun.
Yeah, yeah. It was definitely like if I gave a percentage, it would be like 80-20, or even like 85-15, or something like that. Labrador City, where I grew up, like very weirdly enough, it had a really strong school band for a little while. And then the teacher that taught that school band, who was there basically almost since that school was built, because like that town has only like existed since maybe the 60s or 70s or something. Like it's not a very old town, and like he had been there since the 80s or something, or maybe even the late 70s, I can't remember now. And the music teacher that had been there basically since the school had really started really built like a strong band program where like all these people across the school were involved in it. Like they used to do trips to New York and stuff like that. But the year that I got into high school and became like eligible for school band, he retired that year. Actually, I'm actually not sure where he's at now. I should try to find Jim Cooper. Shout out Jim Cooper. But he was really cool. He was great. Like he was, not that the person that got his place after was not great. She tried to do a lot of stuff, but as soon as he left, a lot of funding got slashed and a lot of people lost interest because it was just
Yeah.
not him anymore, even though Wendy was also amazing, the music teacher that came after him. And she really, like, I think struggled to kind of build stuff up because like all of a sudden it went from this strong school band program to like 5 to 10 people. So like by the time I'd gotten in like school band, I did a little bit of school band stuff or like wind band stuff, but I never played any of those instruments. And like, I don't even think there was like a bassoon or like a tuba in the town. So I basically played like bassoon lines and tuba lines and euphonium lines on bass guitar. There might have been 10 or 12 people in the school band at that time. It went from like 30 or 40 down to like 10 or 12. So it was kind of a fragmented thing. It was not a very enriched and large thing, to no one's fault besides the board of like the whole administration
Right.
and stuff. And ironically enough, when that music teacher left, he still taught private stuff. So he taught me like private theory when I was in grade 10 and 11, because before that I was completely self-taught, and basically was completely self-taught as a guitar player until I went to university. And he actually introduced me to a lot of things like more complex jazz and like Stravinsky and Schoenberg and a handful of different progressive bands and things like that. So he was a real in the weeds kind of music nerd like that. So there's kind of an influence, but kind of not. It's hard to describe.
I'm so glad that you brought up your hometown of Labrador City, which if you're unfamiliar with the geography of Canada, it's in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. I was looking this place up, and what kind of caught my eye was that, according to Wikipedia, which is what it is, it said there's a population of around 7,000 people in Labrador City. Maybe that's outdated, or maybe that's more or less. But I wanted to bring this up because the town that I grew up in, Kentucky, had the same population in my formative years as a musician as well. So I'm sure we have a lot of things that we can commiserate about growing up in a small town, and now kind of doing our own thing, like making careers out of what we do. And you've touched on this a little bit, but what was it like growing up and becoming a musician in this part of Canada?
Yeah, it's kind of contradictory or strangely ironic in a way, because Newfoundland. So you mentioned this about how the province is called like Newfoundland and Labrador, right? Which is kind of a confusing thing. So Newfoundland is like an island, which is kind of more well known than the actual Labrador, the whole Labrador region, because Newfoundland has like a really strong Irish folk community. Like there's a real strong trad music scene, especially in its capital city of St. John's. And there's a real like rich kind of culture there of people that are interested in that kind of like Irish heritage and that kind of descendants and stuff. But Labrador is kind of not like that, even though like pretty much anybody who's of like settler descent who lives in Labrador is usually from Newfoundland and moved there. Most of Labrador is a lot of bare forests and wilderness and coastal communities that are not reserves but indigenous villages still, that are still like quite underfunded and underdeveloped in terms of like how they get support and stuff. Labrador City itself is a mining town. It's built on an iron ore mine. So everybody who like lives there, if you don't work in some sort of public service or anything, you work at the mines. There's no other career besides the kind of standard services that would be there. So like besides maybe the handful of people that work at the hospital or like school teachers or like the odd lawyer or two, or like it's very very small like that. And I'm like laying this all out a little bit because when people think of Newfoundland and Labrador, they think of like that kind of culture and stuff like that, but it's not as vibrant and rich, I feel like, in Labrador, that cultural part, as it is in St. John's. And it's much more isolated and cold and harsh. It's hard to describe too because there's a rich like indigenous culture and communities there. So I'm not downplaying that at all. But I think when people think about like rich musical cultures, they think about regular shows happening or places to like learn, or like Labrador City really. There was maybe growing up, there was maybe less than 15 people that played music, and basically all through high school it was the same rotating door of like 10 kids starting a new band every year with a different formation of whatever they were like into that year. And I don't even know what's happening with that right now, but that was just when we were in schools, and we would like just ask local teen centers and like legions or like orange lodges and things if we could like play there. There's not really a whole lot. And then beyond that there would be like one or two pub cover bands. I don't even think there's a violin or cello in the town, let alone like
Yeah.
people that play it. And honestly, I don't know if a lot of instruments would even survive there because it's so dry and frigidly cold. There's snow on the ground from like October till May. It doesn't really ever touch 30 degrees Celsius, so around the air 80 degrees Fahrenheit, except for maybe the odd day in July, and that is like a heat morning of sorts. Like growing up, in order for school to be canceled, it had to be minus 60 or minus 65 Celsius. It's considered subarctic, and I don't think people get subarctic living allowances. It's similar to like the Northern Territories, and I don't think people realize that because as you drive east Quebec, so Newfoundland is like an island that's a little bit more south of there and basically east of Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia. It's east of that directly, whereas like Labrador is more on par of latitude with the Canadian territories and like the Arctic, because as you drive east through Quebec, you're also driving north. So you're going
Yeah.
like northeast, and Labrador is like a big chunk of mainland attached to Quebec. It's northeast of Quebec. So the small town thing, there's a lot of overlaps in small town life and aesthetic and things like that compared to other places. But the big thing I think that defines, at least for me, defined my existence of growing up and being a musician in Labrador was the isolation within it. It's not like I lived in a small town and I could take a bus for an hour to the next
Yeah.
city or something. Like Montreal is like a 2-day drive or something.
Right.
And 10 hours of that is down like a dirt road with no cell service or nothing. Like it's,
Are there other kind of, I guess, comparably sized towns like Labrador City around it, or is it pretty remote on its own where it's at?
it's pretty remote on its own. And funny enough, it's the most quote unquote, I don't like using this word all the time, but it's the most populated or developed area of Labrador, really, or that region. Like basically there's 2 roads in and out of Labrador City. One is to go to Baie-Comeau, Quebec. So you drive like 10 hours or 7 to 10 hours down a highway, and then you get to Baie-Comeau, Quebec, which is like a coastal Quebec community. And it's like another day's drive to Montreal, basically. And the other road out of Lab City goes further into Labrador to Happy Valley Goose Bay, which is a former like military base and flight stop. And then a lot of the other communities, Happy Valley Goose Bay maybe has like a slightly lower population than Labrador City. And all the other communities all around Labrador are mostly all these different coastal communities. Some of them are fly in, fly out only, or
Yeah.
literally like snowmobile in or out only. Their populations somewhere in the hundreds to a couple thousand tops, maybe. I'd have to check it out. Those are even more remote. Like some of those places don't have internet still. They can't even grow like fresh fruits and vegetables and have like, it's very isolated there. It's yeah, so that's I think the big thing is like I kind of had to, a lot of people who are into anything remotely different than the kind of standard activities there, like which mostly includes, like winter sports and outdoors activities and things like that, which are very popular there. Anybody who was into like anything different really had to leave. So like my handful of friends that were into any kind of really different or in-depth arts or experimental art or anything like that, you really had to leave. There's nothing there for it, and you had to go far away too.
Yeah. So I was finding what you were saying very relatable up until like the harsh conditions of and the remoteness of Labrador City.
Hmm.
But where I grew up, it was primarily agriculture and industrial, like factory type stuff. And that's basically why, like, that's what my parents kind of did, was work in factories and construction sort of stuff. But we had access to bigger cities like 30 minutes away and resources like that. But all over the eastern part of Kentucky, you can drive through it, and it's like you'll come up on these little towns where like it just looks, it's really depressing to kind of look at.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I guess I feel fortunate that I had the right people in my life and the right distance to things that it kind of showed me the wider world. But I personally, I often think, what can I do with my art to kind of shine a light on this part of the world that I'm from, and kind of honor the legacy of like my ancestors, who were largely farmers. That's what people did
Hmm.
where
Hmm.
I come from. So I'm curious to know, like, everything you're describing, I can almost imagine what you're going to say, but when was your first encounter with a composer?
My first encounter, like in person, or in terms of like finding composers or finding living composers.
Yeah, I guess both. I guess in person, like, when was your first time meeting a composer? When I say composer, I mean,
Yeah,
the way we often think of composers.
yeah,
There's a lot of ways you can you can
yeah,
answer
yeah.
this.
Like Western classical scores, things like that.
But
Yeah.
also, yeah, like your first encounter with their music as well, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I could answer that with 2 short things. So the first time that I'm glad that I actually brought up Jim Cooper and music education there earlier, because in some ways a lot of the music that I was finding, like the like experimental rock and progressive rock and things like that, I was finding from like internet rabbit holes, and I was getting into like 70s progressive rock a lot when I was in grade like 10 and 11. And at the exact same time that I was doing that and seeing like how composers like say Bartok or like Copeland or people like that like influenced bands like King Crimson and Emerson Lake and Palmer, and yes, like the same time that I was finding those composers from that rabbit hole, the teacher that I was studying theory with privately who hasn't lived there now for years. He moved away a couple years later now, and I don't know who would be there now that would even go down those rabbit holes. He was also showing me like the Rite of Spring and other music like that, and it was really interesting to me because up until then, like a lot of people, this is a very common thing. A lot of people say, like, a lot of people have this moment where they realize, like, oh, people are still composing today. They're still living
Yeah.
composers, or because, so much of the literature or so much of the life as a classical musician is playing all of these canonical things, right? Or these dead composers, these dead white men, European composers, etc., right? Except actually, honestly, in the band programs, sometimes you play a lot of that living stuff. But yeah, so I mean, that was the first time when I was like started to go down that rabbit hole. And then I found like George Crumb from there and was like blown away, and all that kind of stuff really blew my mind, like seeing what was possible. Like my real intro to classical music is all contemporary music. It's not anything, like it's funny because it's not unique to like other guitarist composers. It's actually kind of the norm for like guitarist composers to be like, oh, I'm into Dillinger's Escape Plan, and that's basically what Bartok and
Yeah.
Rite of Spring was 100 years ago, right? So it's not like actually that weird of a thing for like me, but it is a weird thing for the classical music as a whole to not grow up playing in these kinds of programs, taking piano lessons, taking violin lessons, doing these things. And then really the first time I met a composer would have been the faculty at the university where I did my undergrad. It would have been meeting Andrew Staniland and Clark Ross and the people that were on the composition faculty at Memorial University of Newfoundland, which is the university in the capital of that whole province. And really the only thing that remotely resembles a city in that entire province, both the island and the mainland, the Labrador region. Yeah, that would have been it. I mean, my first classical music concert was probably like audition weekend, honestly, like in person, really. I can't think of if I like a real, like beyond like a kid playing a piano piece at a small recital or at like a small local music, the Kiwanis style music festival. That would have been my first classical music concert even.
Yeah, I think my first one was the Lexington Philharmonic in Lexington, Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
It's a small orchestra, and they do some cool things, but part of their pops programming was like this like Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young esque
Right.
concert with like basically a cover band with the orchestral backing, and
Right.
that was the kind of music my parents knew, was like 70s 80s rock, country music from the 90s. That's what I kind
Yeah,
of
mine too.
grew up.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
exactly.
grew up being exposed to that.
Yeah.
And then I there's so many parallels I feel like between us, that I kind of knew about, but like I'm really finding out about now,
Yeah.
because I also got really into like prog rock in middle school, high school. And my first CD that I bought, my first two CDs I bought with money that I'd earned myself, was Herbie Hancock's, I think, Headhunters album.
Oh, that's so much
And
more cool points than mine. But yeah, keep
well,
going.
and Yes is Close to the Edge.
Oh yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, there you
Yeah,
go.
and I mean, I had like, I've never admitted this before, but I had my parents buy me like the Backstreet Boys. I don't know,
Sure.
you know,
Sure. Yeah.
90s
Absolutely.
music, and then whatever I could find in my dad's CD collection. But yeah, I think because of that, a lot of my music, my early music, and still today, there's a lot of mixed meters. Like, I don't know, that kind of. But the other thing you made me think of was, a friend of mine in middle school introduced me to Frank Zappa at a pretty early point. And like, I just hearing you talk about, guitarists can tend to gravitate towards like Stravinsky and
Hmm.
Bartok and those early 20th century kind of styles. Zappa's Inagata Stravinsky, which is just Inagata Davida with the bassoon solo from Rite of Spring over top of it.
Of course it is.
And it's like so stupid. But I loved it. So can you discuss? This is something I that stood out to me in your bio, and that I'd love to hear more about. But can you discuss what you call the acceptance and
Yeah.
rejection of locality in your creative practice, and how the places you've lived have informed this idea? Because you're talking about growing up in Labrador City, you went to university in St. John's, which you described as the only place in the province resembling a city.
Hmm.
You spent time in New York City for a degree. You're in Toronto now. So kind of, can you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah. This is kind of like a multi-web kind. I'm going to try not to ramble as much as possible and keep it connected and concise. But yeah, when I've thought a lot about over the years, like what influences my music, I think like a lot of people's, like upbringing and their surroundings, and as simple as like like their regions or like locality influence their music. I mean, there's so many obvious and clear like examples, and sometimes it's very overt and sometimes it's very conscious and sometimes it's very like subconscious, of course. But when I think a lot about it, I think about like that is like a very defining or driving factor of a lot of my work or my like interest as a composer, as a creator or musician in any kind of way, because it's so varied and all over the place. And when I talk about like the acceptance or like rejection of like locality, it's kind of like a lot of my work or like influences as a musician are both inspired but also kind of in spite of where I'm from. Or so in some ways they're very like inspired because I grew up listening to a lot of like hardcore music where people talk about like the scenes, like that's such like a thing in emo and hardcore and things like people, or post rock, like people talk about these like scenes that are defined by locality, like and defined by like regions. It's like, the Chicago scene or the DC scene or the LA scene. Like people talk about that stuff all the time and it's like a huge thing. So I'm like, in some ways, I'm very influenced by certain scenes and certain locations. Like I was very influenced by, before going to New York, I was very influenced by so many composers and so many things in New York, like
Right.
not only like Bang on a Cam, but also like Glenn Branca and also like obviously the New York people like Morton Feldman and stuff. So growing up, I lived in this like super isolated place, which basically had no scene, and I was very obsessed or interested in like these scenes that I felt alien to or not a part of or completely disconnected from. So that's one way that it's influenced by that. Like another way is that I've moved around so much and been in these different places. So I've been influenced by the experiences that I've had and the connections that I've made there. And I think that's not an uncommon thing, obviously, to say. Like everybody would say that, but I think a big difference too is like I've always thought a lot about like post regionality, which is a very like 21st century thing. In that, yeah, I've been influenced by all these places, but my connections there like continue because of things like the internet. And I would have never discovered any of these things if it wasn't for the internet. So like that feels very like post regional to me, to continue these like even pre like lockdowns and pre like pandemic stuff where suddenly everybody had to flip to virtual. My norm before all that was finding things online or listening things online and discovering things, or talking on message boards with people like that, or collaborating virtually. And because of, like I was obviously so influenced, and like my time in New York was so huge to me, but like I really only lived there for like 2 years. It doesn't
Right.
sound like
Yeah.
a long time when you think of it, because of visa reasons. Like I was only able to be there for my master's for 2 years, but so many of my connections and collaborators and growing networks of community really like come from these kinds of places that I've been able to maintain. So a lot of like what I'm interested in is, like obviously I'm a product of these environments or like these clashing or different environments, but also in spite of them, like because not a lot of people from like Labrador or Newfoundland even ever leave there. Like they're kind of going through these cycles of what happens there, especially in Labrador. Most people that grew up there, you basically go through high school and then afterwards you get a job at the mines and you continue this kind of cycle, which I don't think there's anything wrong with, but I kind of had to get out and exist in spite of that. And actually, as like a lot of people I knew from there and still talk to from there, especially people of color, or which there's not a lot of at all from
Right.
there,
Yeah.
or queer people, like all those people had to exist in spite of these places, which
Right.
is a very common small town thing. Like that's like a very common small town narrative. But the big defining factor is that it's like way more isolated, like we said there, and harsher kind of environments there. So I could talk about it for like a long time, but I think it's kind of this multi-web kind of thing.
Yeah, you brought up post regionality,
Yeah.
and that's a word I saw for the first time in your bio. And I don't know if you made that up or not, but if you did, kudos because it's amazing. And I was kind of like, well, I can imagine what that means, but I'm not really sure. But the way you talk about the internet, and anytime I have conversations with people about the internet itself as an ecosystem, I have to wax nostalgic because I think you and I grew up. Well, you and I, and like, of course, so many others, I guess, millennials, grew up at a time where it's like we grew up while the internet was growing up, and
Exactly. Yeah.
I just remember the same thing. Around 2000, 2001, 2002, like, I had friends in school, obviously, and we would hang out, but this whole like message boards and like platform for discovery. I remember in 2005 like getting into all kinds of different bands and then discovering like I think it's the Glastonbury Festival in the UK and figuring out how to watch that online and being like, whoa, like this is all this music that I've never heard of before and I love it all
Yeah.
and still love it today. And it also reminds me of our friend Fong Tran with his Computer Room
Yeah.
album, and like that's like a celebration of what we're talking about.
Exactly. Yeah.
And yeah, it's almost like, speaking for myself, if I was coming of age right now, I'm not sure the internet would have. I know it wouldn't have the same impact, and of course, if we had come of age like in the early '90s, when the internet was barely even a thing, it wasn't a household item for
Hmm.
sure.
Hmm.
It's like there's a lot to be kind of negative about in this
Yeah.
world and with
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
current state of the internet. But at the same time, it's like we grew up in this magical time where it really served us in ways that I'm not sure it served any other generation.
Yeah, yeah, because the generation after us, it's kind of like a given. It's kind of
Yeah.
like with the exception of like obviously people that live in certain areas and things like, of course, but like yeah, or under certain like income brackets and things like that. But for a large amount of folks, it's even just the awareness of it, like it just seems to be like a given. And then I feel like yeah, the people you were talking about that are kind of generation before us, they kind of took advantage of it, but it was kind of something that happened after the fact. Like it's like, oh, now this thing is here. Whereas with us, it was yeah, exactly. It's like this thing is developing at the same time as us. Like I meet a lot of people who, whenever I say where I'm from, they always say, I've never met anyone from there. Like not specifically Newfoundland, but like Labrador. And they'll say like what's there, or like who's there, and like why are you here? And like, and I get this question not only just in interviews, it's like, how did you find this music, or how did you discover this music, or what made you want to pursue this career path, or what made you like, and honestly, the only answer I have, like if I give like one answer, it's the internet, because it's how else would I've ever discovered any of this? Like I wouldn't have,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You just gave me the perfect segue for my next question, by the way. And that is, when did you know that you wanted to pursue your craft as a career?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my God. This, yeah. That question is
I
like,
know there's never like one moment, right? It's a cumulative thing.
absolutely. Yeah, I don't know. I've always been really obsessed with music at like a young age, even before I started teaching myself to play guitar through the internet or magazines or things like that. Like I've always been obsessed with music as a kid. Like even before I played anything, I would be told to like stop singing randomly, or stop tapping on like my desks randomly. Or it's weird because in some ways it's always felt very innate and like this automatic thing that I can't live or be without at all times. But it's not because of like my folks, really. Like they listen to a lot of music and they're really into music, but nobody really in my family is a professional musician. Some of
Yeah,
them are not like
same.
musicians at all. So I mean, they definitely had influence over me in terms of like always having music on and having like a wide variety of music on besides the classics, mostly all popular music. So that definitely had an influence. But I think like even as a kid, I always really wanted to pursue it even before I started like playing anything. And then the real like career thing, because I mean, as you're like like growing up playing popular music of any kind, whether that's like metal or whether that's like R&B or pop or whatever, there's kind of this narrative. Maybe it exists less so nowadays, but there's kind of was this narrative at one point that it's like basically you need a big break or something, right? Like there's this narrative where it's like, oh, you could slug it out and maybe you'll like have a big break and then I think that's because of the internet, that's becoming like a less of a thing. Like there's more DIY musicians, there's more like self-sustaining musicians who are not within this kind of upper stratosphere of sorts. Or there's people that are multifaceted as musicians where they can have a career as a musician. It doesn't necessarily mean they need to be like a top 40 artist, and people are aware of those positions in different places now or have access to them because of the internet. But I think a place where I was like, okay, I'm really going to pursue this is literally when I found out that I could like go and do a degree in music. Because I was like, well, the only way I'm going to be able to like get out of Lab City is if I go to university or go to school or go to a college or anything. There's like a very small community college there that mostly does trades programs that feed into the mines, but there's not really like a university or anything there. So I was like, well, the only way for me to get out is to like go to university and do things. And I found out that you could pursue music to various degrees in university. That was kind of the point where it's like, okay, maybe I can figure it out at some point throughout actually going to like higher education for this. I can figure out a way to make like a career out of it. It's always been like a means to an end. Some people are really interested in academia, and like I'm not interested in academia, but it's always been a way to get somewhere else or get something else.
Yeah, I gotcha. One of the many things, I mean, one of the countless things I'll say that I admire about you is that you just
Countless. Oh
seem
my
to.
god.
Yeah. There's a
Thank
lot
you,
of things
Tyler.
I admire about you, man. Yeah, maybe like top three is that you
I admire you
totally.
too, man. Thank you.
um, it's that you embody this kind of what I'll call a DIY spirit in everything you seem to touch. You've launched a record label, you curate concerts, you curate like genre fluid concerts. It's not like you're just programming classical music in quotes. And you set up group commissioning projects, and that's just a few things. Where do you think this DIY mindset comes from, and why is it so important to your work?
I mean, I think it comes from all the stuff. I can go deeper on it, but I think it comes from like all the stuff that I was literally just saying. Is that it was really like the norm. It's like I wasn't put in music lessons as a kid, or I didn't have immediate access to like what a life as a professional musician could be. I didn't have access to a lot of education or to going to seeing concerts or to like I just didn't have that kind of exposure unless I like really had an interest in it and looked for it. So the DIY spirit definitely comes from like growing up always having to like make something happen. So that really just like feels like the norm after a certain point. It's like if I want something to happen, I have to kind of like make it happen with
Oh,
various like
yeah.
results.
I so relate to that because, having gone through like academia until I couldn't stand it anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's not fair. I won't say that. I did try to pursue a doctorate, but
Hmm.
that was kind of, I think, for me, the first inkling of like, I got to do this thing myself because, as you know, as so many people know, academia is really gatekeepy.
Yeah.
And for example, I felt like it was a miracle I even got an interview at a place like Eastman for a PhD. And then I got rejected, and it was like, well, of course, like 2 years ago, I didn't know anything.
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
my path took me away from that, and I feel very happy about that. But whether it's academia or applying for grants or seeking institutional support, that's just something that I have benefited from, every once in a while. But I just got so sick of being told no when I just like wanted to do stuff. Like I just,
Hmm.
I want to put out a CD, and I want to do it my way, and I don't want to apply for grants and like wait 9 months to find out like,
I
oh,
know.
actually you're not going to get the money to do this. And it's like, well, I could have already done it, in the time I've been waiting around.
Yeah.
So for me, that's I would say, and I will say the DIY stuff for me is to a lesser degree than what I see in you. But I think it's a question of accessibility and gatekeeping, and just like, I don't want a ceiling. I just want to do it. And,
Hmm.
if it takes like my own resources, whether that's my own money or my own, blood, sweat and tears and
Hmm.
time, and, it's just, I'll go for it.
Hmm. Hmm.
And if there is some kind of institutional support that comes my way, great. But I'm not counting on it.
Yeah, DIY is like such a weird thing, right? Because there's and like you mentioned this a little bit before, but I mean, like, also I should mention on this podcast, I mean, like, you mentioned creating commissioning projects. I mean, you're the main inspiration for that. Like,
Mm.
you like Orchard projects and your other consortiums were like a huge influence of me of like creating alternative means for commissioning, and not only like alternative means for commissioning, but like communally focused means for commissioning. Like, I remember like when people asked me about like the consortium when I did the saxophone consortium and organized that, which was very influenced by your trombone consortium,
Yeah.
right? And now you have this Orchard project, which I've also done some like arrangements and contributed and like been very inspired by. All these things are very like DIY, but also like something else that people like ask about when they ask about these projects is they ask about like what the benefits are of doing that rather than applying for a grant or rather than going through some sort of institution to do it or supplementing it through some other institution. And like something I've said a lot is that those models sometimes, unless somebody is really lucky or really high profile or really strikes something, those models, like Shelley is a good example of somebody who really taps into that and eschews this kind of model. But I've always seen those institutional models as so like dead end in the end, because
Yeah.
it's like, even if you get like all your funding, you get the grant, yeah, it's great, like all that kind of stuff. These pieces still like get played once and they get like a premiere recording or something, like, you know what I mean? Like they don't actually become these like defining artifacts or like figures, or they don't like grow beyond that. I mean, some people again are very lucky in that, like I feel like Shelley really does do that. Depending, it doesn't matter where her stuff does, it always gets played and it always grows, which is something I really admire about Shelley, right? But like, yeah, like something I really wanted to tap into with the consortium stuff is just like the idea of having a piece played more than once in different places by different people. It's like that is more attractive to me rather than this kind of like one track thing. Because I think a lot about how new music could grow beyond its, and some people are doing this, but how new music could grow beyond its bubble and grow and not like die out, or classical music and how it could not die out. And I mean, like, one thing that they could take from the band or the pop artist model is that like a lot of these like bands record a record and then they tour it, right? Like, and yeah, okay, like it's grindy and it has its ups and downs in its own way for sure, but that is something that a lot of contemporary music or classical or experimental music could take from, like, thinking about a sustainability to a piece of work that you do rather than just creating the piece of work and then moving on to the next one.
I'll just
Yeah,
jump in
yeah,
and say, well, first of all, I appreciate the kind words about how I've inspired you. I have to give two shout outs.
yeah, because it's all a trickle.
Yeah, right. To the composers who introduced me to the idea of consortium. One being James Grant, who is just he's a composer that I'm sure that not enough people know about. But he's so savvy with the business aspects of composing, and that falls into like DIY, right? And then Jem, he's not in academia, and I met him as I was applying for grad school, and he tipped me off to where I did end up getting my master's, to the University of South Florida, specifically for Baljinder Sekon, who is also probably to a more extreme level, even more savvy,
Hmm.
which is saying a lot because Jim is quite savvy. And I remember in grad school, Baljinder giving us an assignment to create a consortium,
Wow.
and we really dug into that. And I would say, for reasons I won't get into, it wasn't a very successful project for me, but it was my first one, I think, and it really opened my eyes to this way of creating new music through collaboration with performers is a win-win for everyone. I no longer have to tell a performer who wants to commission me, I want thousands of dollars from you or whatever. I can
Yeah.
say, you know, and that's always an option. And actually, I've recently been commissioned by a saxophonist who that's the route he wanted to go, and I was
Yeah.
like, but I always say, we can do a consortium because, one, it makes it more accessible for them, monetarily speaking. It makes it more financially accessible for everyone involved. People who have never had the opportunity to commission a new work, they get to,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I've done consortiums for as little as $15, like join in for $15, $20, because that's really attractive to me. I want as many people on board as possible, because like you said, then the piece has a bigger life, more people can play it. And then the other thing I've noticed, which I'm sure you've noticed as well, is that these connections that form where you'll have X amount of people join your original consortium, and then one of those people, it might be somebody you've never met before, who you hit it off with, they love the music, and then they commission you for a new piece. And so
Exactly.
that,
Exactly.
and so I will never not talk about consortiums, because you're right. Given the choice between writing a chamber work that a lot of people join in on, or writing, I'd love to write like a big orchestral work and get it played by a major orchestra. I think that's something we
Yeah.
all are interested in. But given the choice between the two, I think at this point in my life and in my creative career, I'm going to pick the consortium. Because it feels more mission driven. It expands the bubble, as you say, and it's good for everybody, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what to me is like, maybe this is again like a very popular music mindset, which for a while I really tried to like. It's ironic how a lot of things have turned out, because like one thing that really drew me to, and this is all still connected to it, even though we're going off on these very important, I think, tangents, is like, one thing that really drew me to contemporary classical music and new music was at first actually this institutional legitimacy, or this kind of validation or legitimacy for something that is not understood on the first listen, or not massively popular. Like, because I was into so much weird rock and metal music that even though it was popular, and obviously this band had fans or whatever, like there's this kind of idea where it's just like, how does someone find validation in something that's like less popular? And in popular music, that's such like a thing that people use as like a metric, right, of success. And I was really drawn to like contemporary music at first, because I was like, wow, it's like this stuff really requires, like deeper listening. Sometimes it's not massively popular. People don't even know it exists. And these people are still successful. They're still considered to be, like very legitimate, and they're finding legitimacy through this kind of institutional support. And for a while that was like really attractive to me. And then the ironic thing, I said this in another interview recently, the ironic thing is that as I got further into that kind of music, the only composers, or the only people that I really liked what they were doing, were actually doing DIY stuff beyond that anyway. So
Yeah.
it's like I kind of like, it was kind of foregone or whatever. Like like I started getting in and finding all this music, and a lot of the composers that I didn't really care for were like completely created or products of the institution. And then a lot of the composers that I was interested in, while having like a degree of institutional support like you and I have, or and I think this is where I was going before, where I talked about like how DIY is so interesting, because in our world, it's so specifically like different for everybody. And there's so many variations or degrees of it, because like a group like Bang on a Can were so DIY when they really started their marathon and said, we're going to do these things, and finding performers. And I've talked to Michael and Julie about this like a whole lot, and how when they were in like, their grad school, they couldn't find like any performers to play their music, and how like this stuff didn't exist, and how like they did a lot of things like very DIY, and in spite of not having institutional support. But it's funny because they also went to Ivy League schools. So it's
Yeah,
like,
right.
like it's like on the one hand there's institutional support, but then there's like not. And I kind of feel like we also straddle that kind of dichotomy, where it's like everything that we do is not supported by institutions, but also we are products of it in another way as well. So it's like, yeah, it's an interesting thing to talk about now. It's kind of so ingrained.
I feel like it comes back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier, but about something differently, but this acceptance and rejection at the same time.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
that kind of thing. And just as a disclaimer, because I know that academics, if you're listening, you can be a little touchy, and that's okay. And we're not, I will admit, given the opportunity, I will go full bore
Yeah, yeah.
anti institution and anti academia. But That's not to say I don't recognize the good things about it. There's a lot of good people doing work in that space.
Yeah.
A lot of people I'm close with that I love, and I'm not trying to paint a broad brush, but it's just the nature of, that's what this podcast is all about, talking about our experiences, and this is what I've experienced. It seems like you've experienced the same kind of thing, so that's I
Yeah.
won't go too hard on it, but
No. And yeah. And I mean, like, yeah, there's lots of great things that people can do in academia and lots of great things that institutions support. I mean, like, I have a PhD. Clearly, I don't hate them that much. I mean, like,
yeah,
clearly, I could, but it's like you said earlier when you're talking about your Eastman experience, is like when I applied for doctoral and master's programs, it's like everywhere that I got in or everywhere that I didn't get in, it all made sense. It was like, yeah, of course I wouldn't get into this place because like what I want to do or what I'm interested in or the music that I make is just, it's not there. Like everywhere I went to go do an academic degree at was a place where there was some sort of, I don't know if I would say like DIY spirit necessarily, but there was some sort of freedom or space to explore or be yourself or do something that was a little bit off the standard path. Like NYU was like that, Memorial was like that, and Western was like that as well. So, they exist. It's just there's different degrees or variations of all this stuff. I say a lot that, and I'll stop rambling on it, but I say a lot that it's like, again, this acceptance or rejection kind of thing is like, I go to like, basement hardcore shows and play those, and everybody thinks I'm like the smart academic there. And then I go to like the academic show in like my death metal band t-shirt, and everyone's like, oh, this is the edgy
yeah,
person. It's like, I can't win. It's like,
yeah. I love that.
Yeah, me
Um,
too.
so maybe a tangential part of this DIY conversation. I just have to acknowledge that you are quite an advocate for underrepresented artists and people. And please correct me if I'm wrong here, but this seems to be a parallel but related endeavor along with your work in the DIY space. So can you tell us a little bit about this facet of your work, this advocacy work that you do as a composer and an artist?
Yeah. And I want to also say as like a little disclaimer, like whenever I talk about this stuff, I try to be very mindful about taking the space or speaking for
Yes.
or moving into like white savior territory, because it's not the same, or it's very easy for a lot of people, like white straight passing or even
It
white
feels
passing
like
people
it's a
to,
fine line. I
yeah,
feel like, yeah.
yeah, it's very easy to kind of slip into that, and there's a lot of people that do exploit and take advantage of that. So I want to try to be mindful of that and always like check myself on that. But yeah, it is totally related to that, because the true DIY communities or the true outside of the institution communities always veer in those places. They always move towards queer people, people of color. And I mean, like, even though like I'm not a person of color myself, it's like I grew up in a place with mostly an indigenous population. I had like a lot of indigenous friends and collaborators when I was there, and moving beyond and continuing. So a lot of stuff is new to me sometimes, or like I'm still learning, and obviously like always learning and always like growing and having new experiences and stuff. But also it kind of just feels like the natural thing to do. It's like everybody that I connect with is somebody from some sort of different background or some sort of, I don't even like saying necessarily, I think it's definitely true, but I don't even like saying marginalized. Sometimes like I more use like intersectional, or I'll
Yeah.
use like something like that, because everybody's kind of a product, like we've been talking about, of their various experiences and their identities, and that kind of like intersectionality that exists in all this stuff. And yeah, I mean, on the one hand, it sounds like such a simple answer, because I kind of say like with what I'm interested in, it's just kind of the natural thing that happens. But you do have to like push for it. It really is easy sometimes just to default to, if you're doing programming, like only programming like white dudes, or if you're doing like it does, because there's over representation of that group in not canon, but in the whole world. And it's interesting to talk about, because it's like when I went to go do my master's at NYU, out of our 7 or 8 or 9 grad school concert music composers, I think, trying to think now, unless I'm forgetting No, me and Kyle were the only two white men, right? Like it was is me, Shelly, Fong, Allison, Nick Joven, like there's like a group of us, right? Stefan, like all these people were all people from different backgrounds, right? And grew out of these like different kind of backgrounds, and it's what makes all this stuff interesting, and you connect on these kinds of deeper levels of intersectionality when you really think about those kinds of things and you really open up to these experiences. So yeah, I don't really know if that's like a great answer or anything. It just feels like it's more of like a fluid thing that's always been involved in what I do, but it continues to grow. So it to me, it just seems like what else would I do? And I talk a lot about this with Jerry Pergolesi, who like I'm involved with so many countless projects with, from the Intersection Festival in Toronto to Contact the Ensemble to various other things. And it's something that he's always been interested in pushing towards as a queer person, and as like what his work's always been interested in. And for a very long time in the 90s and 2000s, a lot of the works that and things that he wanted to do would get so much pushback from institutions trying to program Black composers, or trying to program like queer programs and things like that, and like all women programs. He used to get like a lot of pushback from that, like playing the music of these people. And now it's such a checkbox. Now it's such like
Yes.
it's such a
Yeah.
way to get easy funding for somebody who's not actually sincere about it. And
Yeah.
it's a complicated thing to navigate, but it's still important nonetheless, So
Yeah. I appreciate your sensitivity to it. And of course I wouldn't have brought it up if I didn't appreciate the work that you do as well,
yeah, yeah,
in
yeah.
that space.
The main thing I really try to do is just decenter myself. I may say like the most I can continue to decenter myself while supporting. That's I think like a big number one. So
Yeah, I agree. I think we've probably already touched on this indirectly, so I'll ask you more directly about this. But what would you describe as the primary pillars of your creative practice?
oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, to boil it down to like everything we've been talking about,
Yeah,
like
let's sum it up.
yeah, yeah, no, I think I could do a lot of stuff. I mean, community, absolutely. Transparency, for sure. Different degrees of sustainability. Yeah, and of course, like intersectionality, for sure. Absolutely. Like all those things find their way into all their different projects. And sometimes it's very surface level to the point of where it's just like, oh, this is a post genre, multi genre thing. And sometimes it's much deeper than that, as in like this is a like mutual aid thing or something.
Yeah.
So yeah.
When you say sustainability, because I feel like we've kind of touched on the other pillars that you just mentioned, but when you
Yeah.
say sustainability, what do you mean?
I mean more like the sustainability of connections and friendships and
Yeah.
collaborations and music, and actually very similar to what you were talking about before when you talk, because it's obviously sustainability. A lot of people think about like environmental issues and things
Right.
like that, which I obviously like care about, but I think that's also, I mean, we're two, like left-leaning artists. Of course we care about the environment, like
Yeah.
like, and of course we're trying to do our part and that kind of thing. So I think it's like a lot of people are very heavily involved in that. And when I talk about, yeah, like sustainability, I talk about like interpersonal relationships and collaborations, and like more of towards like a sustainable quote unquote career, rather than, and it's very much touched on the thing that you talked about, where it's like when you have these consortiums, like the fact that of what can continue to grow out of them. That's a main thing. Like I'm really interested in some sort of like continuous fluid cycle, rather than a start and a stop point
Yeah.
for a lot of what I do.
Just to add to that, with my own experience, and thank you for clarifying that, because I wasn't
Yeah.
sure if you meant environmental sustainability
Yeah.
or what you just described.
Yeah.
I think the flip side of that for me, and one criticism I am very very strong about with what I see happening in our world of new music, is transactionalism, like
Exactly.
seeing,
Yeah.
and so and what I mean by that is this group is going to commission this composer, and it almost seems like a matter of optics, and they'll play the piece once, and then they'll cycle through that program and then commission the next one. And I've been very fortunate recently to work with performers who are mindful of that, and they recognize that, and they have told me directly, I don't want to just play your piece a handful of times on a program and then move on to my next slate of commissions or whatever. Like, I want to live with your music. I want to play it a bunch. I want to record it. I want to let everyone know about it. I want to give it a life. And it like almost stunned me because it's so opposite of what I've experienced and what I see other people doing. So
Yeah.
now I have a word for that part of my creative pillars. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I even like what you're talking about is something that I really value and make a point to do, like as a performer, when I'm putting like that hat on as a guitarist and as a performer. And I've gotten that comment from a lot of like composers before. It's like, wow, thank you for playing this piece so many times. It's like so many times is like 5 or 6. I'm like, what do you mean?
Yeah.
Like so many times? Like there's a while. It's not, but also like I think about that a bit as a composer too. Like, and I didn't think about this. I've thought about this before, but I didn't think about it in terms of how it relates to this podcast until you just mentioned it. But like, I also think about that like a lot as a composer, like as in like when someone plays a piece, how much of what you've written is like make or break based on a series of like factors. Like can someone play this in a different space and it will still come off. Maybe it will obviously not sound the same as if it was in a hall, but if someone plays this in like a very dry small space rather than a hall, will it still have an impact on people? If they play it to people who are talking at the same time in like a bar or in a public place somewhere, will it have the same impact on people? If somebody doesn't have the access to the same equipment, like that's something I'm really interested in. It's like if there's like a piece of equipment that someone needs in order to make this happen, will they be able to access it? And if they can't, can they still realize this piece? Like these kinds of things are all related to sustainability for me, because like when I write something, I want it, not only do I want what I play to have a life and like my projects and collaborations and interpersonal connections to have a life, but I also want it like for my music. Like I want, beyond just writing for the standard forms of a string quartet or piano solo, if I write for somebody to use like cello with effects pedals, it's like if somebody doesn't have that same effects pedals, like how would they realize it, or will they have access to that? Is it, in like that stuff I'm interested in terms of sustainability.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. It's so good. The tricky part for me, adding on to what you just said, is, I've written a lot of piano music, and thinking about non-standard techniques in particular, playing inside the piano, and pianos are constructed differently, and I've learned to have how do I navigate that, because there might be a crossbar across the strings that I had written at one piano that didn't have that, and then a performer writes to me and they're like, I can't touch this. I can't touch the string. And figuring that out. But and having a flexibility to that is what just play it down an octave. I'm not too wed. It's more about the sound and the gesture than the specific pitches, for example. But kind of the most extreme version of that, and it's not really extreme, but I guess the most comprehensive issue that I've had to deal with in that regard, thinking about playing inside the piano. Pianist had commissioned me to write a movement of a larger piece that utilized, all these non-standard techniques, plucking the string, harmonics, all that kind of stuff. And then she got to learning it, and it was with violin as well. And she was like, can you make a version of this if I had to play it on an upright piano? And I was like, oh yeah, I don't mind doing that at all. But then it got me thinking, I should do that with everything. I should do that with any piece that, like, so it gets into this realm of like, not arrangements, but like alternate versions of, different ways of playing it. And like you said, realizing the piece so that it is the most accessible version of my music possible, that anyone could play it, to a certain degree. We're not talking about difficulty and the stuff like that. We're just
Obviously, there's a place where it becomes like compromising or something like that, or where it just doesn't make sense. And I think everybody just has a different threshold on that kind of thing, But yeah, no, it's a huge. That's something I admire quite a bit about the band community and like other things, and like like how there's flexibility in like the number of players to a part, or if one instrument can't play this, then another one can, and that that's something that I think is yeah, I've had like a similar kind of thing too, where it's like you write a piece with like live electronics and someone says like, I don't have access to the software, or I'm going to play this in a space where we don't have time to check those things or mic the piano or whatever. And can you make this a tape part now? Or can you, like all those things, yeah, I think are important. And I don't think a lot of people actually really consider them important, or, yeah.
Yeah. One question that I always ask folks that I'm really excited to ask you this question. What is a piece of music or a song, a book, a piece of art, any artistic object is the way I'm describing it, that didn't necessarily, I mean, yes, influenced your work, but like kind of changed your life, like your creative life, like opened you up to like a whole universe that you weren't aware of before?
Oh my God, there's so many. It's hard to, I mean, I'm sure you won't mind if I pick a handful of different things,
Yeah,
but
go
like,
for it. Let's hear it.
but like it is like, yeah, it's a hard thing for sure. I mean, music wise, besides everything we've already mentioned, coming across like Between the Buried and Me's Colors, that album as a kid was huge for me. That was a big thing, like discovering King Crimson, like as well. And I like a lot of things we've already mentioned in this later in life, because there's definitely some later things that really changed and blew things wide open, like or like were really interesting to me. A lot of the recent electronic music that's involved in like the hyper pop world really changed the game for me, thinking a lot about those things. So like a lot of stuff produced by AG Cook, or even like a lot of stuff that, this is not necessarily hyper pop, it's more experimental electronic, but a lot of the stuff that Orange Milk Records was putting out a couple of years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, that definitely was like, whoa, because like that stuff was like, this sounds so meticulously composed, but so not within like a grid. Like that was something that I was really interested in, or like these like huge juxtapositions of textures just cause, and like really going for it. But also there's like visual mediums or like other things. Like I remember when I discovered like House of Leaves as a kid, I was really obsessed with that book.
Yes.
Like that
Oh yeah,
really
I
blew
know
things
that book.
open. Yeah, of
Yep.
course you do. I'm not surprised at all.
I think I could reach and grab it from where I'm
Yeah.
sitting. Maybe. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
awesome.
that's like a big book for a lot of people. But yeah, yeah, exactly. When I discovered that, I was like, that was really influential. I mean, a lot of the things I think that like really change the game, as you say, like for me, are things that show that something that I've kind of had rumbling around in my head is possible, or show a way of achieving something that was rumbling around in my head as being like possible, like these kinds of crazy juxtapositions of things, or you know that's something huge. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally relate. I love like when it's like you discover something and it hits you so hard, and then you think about it and you're like, wait, I've already been doing this. Like this is just
Mm,
confirmation, you
yeah.
know.
Yeah.
I want to dig just a little bit deeper into to what you just said, and I'm wondering what ways do you look like when you talk about prog rock, when you talk about ambient music, hyper pop, we've covered a lot of ground here, so I'm not going to list all of it, obviously. But,
Yeah.
when you look outside of the classical, Western or even contemporary classical repertoire, what do you grab from those genres for your music? How does it inspire the work that you do?
It inspires it in a lot of the ways that we're talking about, like a couple or a handful of things that I'll list is like one thing that, these are all kind of more philosophical in a way rather than like sonically. Like one thing that that kind of music inspires me is like the fact that people do it in all sorts of different venues, where and that it can exist in all these different kinds of spaces and have different reactions in different spaces. Another thing that it influences me is that, or another way that it influences me is the way that that music places emphasis on the recorded medium, and the way that that music places emphasis on like having an album, and having that album almost be like a statement and like a business card, or like like something that is a statement. This is something I've tried to struggle a lot with lately, especially like when I meet random people like on the train or like at coffee shops or things like that, and they say like, oh, you're a musician, like what should I listen to and what should I find? And I'm just like, I don't know where to start. Do I send you this like
Yeah.
guitar piece that I played? Do I send you this piece of mine for somebody? Because it's just like, in one way, I value the kind of multifaceted approach that we have to have nowadays in order to be like successful, independent composers and creatives and things like that. But in another way, it's like, for like a pop art, it's so easy to be like, yeah, here's my most recent single, here's my video on YouTube or whatever, or here's my recent album or something. And it's like not a thing that even people that are just composers, like people that don't really do a lot of performing, like where do you start, you know? So I think that's something I'm trying to think a lot about and take something from, is like, I think a lot of classical music, there's obviously places where they go away from this, like New Amsterdam and Cantaloupe, and these, there's certain labels that definitely diverge from this, but like classical music uses recording so much as like almost archival, even when it's a studio recording, or even when it's a performance. It's like, even when it's like a professional studio recording or a release, it's so much like this is a document of the piece or something, rather than the actual piece of art itself. And I think that's valid and interesting in a lot of ways, because it means that you have these different recordings of the same piece that you can play against each other. And I think that's really interesting and important for performers. But like myself, as somebody who didn't get to see a lot of live music and like no live classical music until I was older, the access to recordings is so important to me. And being able to have like good quality recordings of things, that's such like an obvious thing for the pop or electronic music world. Like that's the starting point, not the performance, right? So I definitely place more emphasis on the recording being representative rather than a performance. So
Yeah. I mean, as someone who does not perform, I have been a performer. I don't consider myself one anymore, for better or for worse. What you're talking about, like the psychology of making a recording of a piece of music, for me, and this is something that I have thought about, I've struggled with, is, for example, I just recorded a string quartet piece. And to me, it's like the way I approach that recording is, okay, like this is going to be it. This is going to have to serve as an example of anyone who chooses to play this piece in the future. When it's actually like you listen back to old recordings of older pieces and it's like, oh, I wish I could change this. That's what I feel like. I wish I could change this piece. I'm
mhm.
noticing all these things I want to change about it, but there's a recording, so I can't. And that's something that, having this conversation, I realize it's like that doesn't have to be the rule. you
No, no,
know
no, no. Obviously, things change for
yeah.
sure. Yeah.
And so I think what you're saying is very interesting from the perspective of, I guess, the way we are all mostly conditioned, probably from institutions, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. There's a lot to be said about that. I mean, I change depending on the day and the piece and everything too, because I think there's also something very beautiful about the fact that in this music, like, it's a norm that there can be all these different recordings of the same piece that are so different, or that, yeah, a piece could be recorded before, but you can change it. Like, yeah, like I think that's something really interesting and really cool about classical music at the exact same time, even though I innately or in my core, I kind of am the flip side of that, for
mm,
better or for worse as well. So,
yeah. What do you think you'd be doing right now if it wasn't a musician, composer making your art?
oh yeah, I actually like this question.
If there was a fork in your life that you could
Yeah.
would have went down the other direction, what would you be doing right now?
Oh man. I mean, as a lot of like struggling artists, or like as a lot of musicians who have faced ups and downs, I've thought a lot about this before. Like I like because people, a lot of people, especially like lately, I know a lot of people that are involved in like the contemporary music world, branching out into like secondary careers and then having that as their main non-music career, while they still like do music and still play and stuff like that. They just aren't using it as their main thing, which I think is really cool and admirable in its own way too. I think if I was doing anything else, I'd be like a teacher of something else. Like I think like if
Yeah.
I had to pick something that's completely non-musical, I would have went into some sort of the education field, and I'd be some other kind of educational administrator, or a teacher of a different subject or something like that. I'm not sure what that would look like off the top of my head. Because that's something that I find like I have gravitated a lot towards. We haven't talked about a lot about that throughout this, but I feel like it's kind of all integrated in a way, is that like I've always done like a lot of teaching, and I've always done a lot of, whether it's private guitar or whether it's other kinds of topics or things like that. I think a lot of people sometimes they see teaching as just like the day job until they don't have to do it anymore. Especially like guitar players are like, oh, this is my like, my way to like make ends meet on this or something like that. And it's definitely that financially, but I mean, I also feel like it's like teaching is something that's, as long as it goes really well, it's something that like actually gives me energy. Like
Right.
it
Yeah.
gives me inspiration and energy, and it keeps me on my toes, because like if a student, whether that's in guitar or in theory or in composition or anything like that, starts moving beyond what I do, like it actually means that I have to kind of like keep bettering myself as well. And I have to like interact with people of many different kinds, and like how to still progress and see success with them and interact with them. So like if I was doing anything else, it would probably be something in the educational field beyond what I was doing. Maybe like community education programs or something
Yeah.
like that, maybe.
You just reminded me of this thing that this girl I dated in high school told me. Weirdly enough, she was a violinist and she was very competitive, and she was very competitive with me as a euphonium player, which was like, what is wrong with you?
This is not your fight. This is not your
Yeah, yeah,
battle.
yeah. But she, one time she was just kind of like, you know, those who can't do the thing, they go on to teach the thing. And
Yeah, such a
even as like
thing.
a
Yeah.
15, even as a 15-year-old, I remember thinking like, and I, I feel strongly also about like, I love to be in an educator role. I don't think it's for me full time, but even as a 15-year-old, I remember thinking like, well, that's like the opposite of what you want. Like you want someone
Yeah.
teaching you who's like really good at what they do. And as I've gotten older, I guess the extension of that is you want someone teaching you who's okay with like you exceeding them.
Yeah.
It's like that's like the ultimate goal, right? And it's so weird when I meet people or hear stories from people about educators in their lives who are like insecure. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
uh that's
Yeah,
a
that's
thing.
such an old, like that's such I mean I've heard that like some, like lots of times in different forms or different variations of that. Because yeah, the idea is that like if you fail at a certain career, well, you could always just go and like teach it, because you have there's like this kind of idea, this false idea I think that people have, that it's like if somebody was not teaching, or if somebody was actually successful in something, then they wouldn't be teaching it, because they would just be like doing it. Or there's this idea that it's like if you fail at something, well, you can always go back to teaching it because you have the materials, and now you can like instill them in others. But like yeah, there's so many other variables with that, because like I
Oh yeah.
know of so many people that are like really brilliant artists and really brilliant creators who are not like amazing teachers, because they don't know how to like formulate and communicate what they're trying to do in different situations, or for different people to receive it in different ways. Like I think that's like the mark of like a really good teacher, is that like they're somebody who can like step outside of themselves and use all the knowledge and experience that they have and draw from it, and then formulate it for somebody else to like consume and receive. Like my dad never went to like any school after high school or anything. Like he didn't go to college or anything like that. And he's most of my life he's been a truck driver, and he's worked in various other jobs throughout the years, including like staff positions with some things. But most of the times he's a truck driver, whether that's a moving or fuel trucks or like heavy equipment stuff. And it's funny because it's like I am like an awful driver. I hate driving. I tried to learn to drive standard multiple times. I get so nervous behind even like a truck, let alone like another piece of equipment and stuff like that. And it's really does not come natural and like innate to me. And things like operating like equipment like that are so natural to him. He's like really like a really brilliant driver. Like he can parallel park a massive loaded truck with like no back camera and like
Wow.
no
Yeah.
view, like within a tiny space. Like it's really actually mind blowing. And it's like, And he's really brilliant with all those kinds of things, probably more than he thinks or realizes. But anytime he's tried to teach me how to do any of these things, it's so natural to him that he just says, yeah, you just do this. And for me, I'm thinking, wait, but why do I do that? And what does that mean? And what is, like, when you use that term for that tool or for that gesture, I don't know what that means. Right. And it's like, that's something that I think about, like when somebody like says, oh, you just do this. Oh, that's a lot of thing a lot of guitar teachers do. Like they go and they just look up the tab, you just
Just
play this.
just do
And then,
that.
and
Yeah.
then somebody's like, well, why can't this chord sound? It's like, oh my God, I had so many of these conversations. And it's like, yeah, you have, that's a skill. Teaching is a skill in itself,
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally. Is there a tool that you use in your practice? And this could be either, I'm asking mostly as a composer, but also as a
Mm.
guitarist. Is there a tool in your practice that you think everyone should know about and that everyone else could benefit from?
In general, it would be helpful. This goes back to my like recorded thing. I think in general, I think something that everybody could benefit from tool wise is like learning how to record themselves and make it sound decent. And I'm sure you relate to this as well with everything that you do from this podcast or from like, from
Sure.
everything. It's like, yeah, like obviously nobody should have to learn how to like be this amazing audio engineer because that is like the position and you need to have dedication to that, just like a performer or a composer has to have dedication to like that craft. But to be able to, even, I mean, I think maybe lockdowns and some virtual things have changed that a little bit. I started slightly changing that, but yeah, so many like players, like if you need to record yourself very quickly and like normalize the audio and not clip, or like how to use like a DAW generally. Like you don't have to be a master at it or something, but I think that's something that I use so much and it became natural to me because of the DIY trying to do stuff, but also because guitar is so drawn towards technology and equipment. It's something that like a lot of composers who are a little bit more traditional or instrumentalists who are a little bit more traditional, it's just such a foreign world to them. Just learning how to gain stage stuff is so important. It's like huge. So,
And you don't need, yeah, like you said, you don't need fancy equipment. There's a lot
no.
of free resources that people can use to get it done, to do
Yeah,
this.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Even using something like, I mean, I think it doesn't even work on newer Macs, but like even something like Audacity or something like that, like
Yeah.
people were using that. And it's like, I've gotten like archival recordings from concerts before that were just way too quiet. And before I had like a expensive DAW, just normalized it in Audacity and did the cuts and did fades and stuff like that goes such a long way.
I have one final question for you, which is potentially the most open-ended question I'm going to have. What is something that you've never had a chance to say about your art that you've always wanted to share with people?
This is also an open-ended answer, but I probably would say this because I feel like I'm saying this like a lot lately in some things, is like that this is, or this should be like a process for all of us. It's like I think it's important for people to get to a place where they do feel like comfortable, or to a place where they feel like they've reached like a certain level of comfortability and proficiency, and like some people would cynically say where they're coasting or something like that. I
Yeah.
think that's really cool and validating and fulfilling to receive. But I think that it's so easy for people to see something and see the creative. I was even watching a video earlier today where somebody was talking about this with digital content. Like it's so easy for people to see something and see the finished product and say, oh, like I need to get there and I need to do that and I need to do these things and blah, blah, blah. And not realizing that for that person, it's also like a process. Like I talk to people sometimes and they're like, how did you like do this label stuff? Or how did you get to like writing this piece? Or how did you get to understanding how to use like pedals and how to like dial in stuff on an amp? Like those questions I get from like other people sometimes, just thinking that it's like, oh, well, you just learn it and you get there. And it's just like, it's honestly, it's a process that I still feel like I'm experiencing. Like I'm still learning how to do stuff still, like, and it's hard for me often to not, or it's hard for me to not see what I'm doing as like a part of a continuous process. Like sometimes I really have to actually stop myself and take a step out and say, wait a minute, I'm actually like achieving things. I'm not just moving along with no achievements or something, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, I hope that's helpful.
No, that's really good stuff. Andrew, man, this was awesome. Thanks so much for taking some time and for just like sharing all the things you just shared. It's like I said, it's good stuff, man.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on. I always love chatting with you.
I think you've probably figured out now why I'm such a huge fan of Andrew's. And I would definitely encourage you to investigate all the work that he does more broadly, the stuff that he mentioned today and stuff that he didn't mention. You can do that by visiting his website, anmusiccomposer.com. And I've also got a link to his site and his record label, People Places Records, over on the show notes page at looseleaftransmissions.com. I'm Tyler Kline, and thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Music Maker. Music Maker with Tyler Kline is a production of Loose Leaf Transmissions, made for all ears. We're online at looseleaftransmissions.com. You can find more episodes of the podcast and ways to support us on the Loose Leaf Transmissions website as well. Thanks so much for listening today. Until next time, I'll see you later.